Black girl spotted at laundromat every night. Sheriff bursts into tears after discovering why. Hello, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and comment what you think is going to happen, and let's see if you can guess it. Write your prediction below, and at the end, I'll give you the answer. It was well past midnight, and the sleepy town of Brooksville had long since fallen silent. The streets were empty, save for the occasional rustle of leaves and the distant hum of a passing car. But in a small, dimly lit laundromat on the corner of Main Street, the faint buzz of the washing machines echoed through the quiet night. Every night at precisely 11 p.m., a young black girl, no older than 14, would slip into the laundromat, her tiny frame nearly disappearing beneath the oversized hoodie she wore. Her hair, neatly braided, framed her tired, yet determined face. She carried with her a basket of laundry, always the same size, filled with the same worn clothes, and she would sit quietly in the corner while the machines whirred around her. No one seemed to notice her, and those who did said nothing until the sheriff did. Sheriff Daniels was a man of routine. In his mid-50s, with a weathered face and a stern demeanor, he was known for running Brooksville with a tight grip. Every night, as part of his patrol, he passed by the laundromat, occasionally stopping to ensure everything was in order. For weeks, he had noticed the girl, but thought little of it. Perhaps she came from a family that worked late shifts, or one that struggled to keep up with life's demands. He'd assumed someone would eventually come to pick her up, but as the nights passed, his curiosity grew. Why was she always there at the same time, alone? One night, after finishing his rounds, Sheriff Daniels decided to approach the laundromat. The girl was sitting on the same plastic chair, her hands folded neatly on her lap. She stared at the tumbling clothes as if lost in thought. When the sheriff entered, the door's bell jingled softly, and she glanced up with startled eyes. "Evening," he said, trying to keep his voice gentle. She nodded but said nothing, her gaze quickly returning to the spinning dryer. Sheriff Daniels took a seat a few chairs away, watching her for a moment before speaking again. "You come here often?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. The girl remained silent, her eyes betraying a hint of fear. The sheriff sighed, sensing something deeper, something hidden. Determined to find out more, Sheriff Daniels began visiting the laundromat regularly during his night patrols. Each night, the girl would be there, always with the same laundry and always alone. Despite his attempts to strike up a conversation, she remained guarded, offering only brief answers or none at all. He began to worry. This wasn't just a girl doing late-night chores. There was something wrong, something she wasn't telling. His gut told him to dig deeper, but he didn't want to scare her away. Little did he know, the truth he was about to uncover would break him in ways he could never have imagined. Sheriff Daniels couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this young girl's story. Each night he saw her, the gnawing curiosity in his mind grew stronger. The next night, as she walked into the laundromat, he was already there, pretending to examine a local flyer pinned to the bulletin board. The girl hesitated at the door, clearly surprised to see him again, but she quickly averted her gaze and moved to the same washing machine she used every time. She loaded the clothes, hit the start button, and sat in her usual spot. Daniels couldn't take it anymore. This time, instead of trying to make small talk, he approached directly. "What's your name?" he asked, his voice soft yet commanding. The girl fidgeted, her eyes darting to the floor. After a few moments of tense silence, she whispered, "Nia." It was the first time she had spoken to him since his late-night visits began. Daniels nodded slowly, taking a seat next to her. "Nia," he repeated. "Do your folks know you're out here this late, every night?" She stiffened at the question, and her eyes began to water, but she said nothing. Sheriff Daniels felt a tug at his heart, a rare sensation for a man known for his tough, unyielding persona. There was something deeply unsettling about the way Nia seemed to carry the weight of the world on her young shoulders. "I'm not here to get you in trouble," he assured her gently. "But I need to understand why you're here, and why you're all alone." The laundromat was quiet except for the steady hum of machines, and the tension between them grew heavier by the second. Nia wiped her eyes quickly, trying to compose herself, but her small, trembling frame revealed her vulnerability. After what seemed like an eternity, Nia spoke again, her voice barely audible. "I don't have anywhere else to go. she admitted, her words hitting Daniels like a punch to the gut. The sheriff's heart sank. He had seen children in trouble before, but there was something about Nia's quiet strength and the way she kept showing up, night after night, that made him realize this was more than a typical case of neglect. "What do you mean? Where are your parents?" he pressed, trying to keep his tone gentle. Nia's lips quivered, and her face paled. "They're gone," she whispered. Sheriff Daniels knew there was more to this story, and whatever it wasn't going to be easy to hear. Nia's words hung in the air like a heavy cloud. Sheriff Daniels leaned back, digesting the simple yet gut-wrenching admission. "They're gone." His mind raced with questions, but he could sense that pressing her too hard might scare her off. He decided to take a different approach, trying to keep the conversation flowing without overwhelming her. "How long have you been coming here, Nia?" he asked, watching her closely. She shrugged, eyes downcast. "A while," she replied softly. It wasn't much, but it was a start. As the minutes ticked by, the rhythmic thumping of the washing machines seemed to calm the atmosphere between them. Nia began to open up, slowly, cautiously. "After my mom passed away, I didn't know where to go. We used to live in a small apartment nearby, but when she got sick, we couldn't pay the rent anymore." Daniel's stomach churned as she spoke. He hadn't expected this. The girl's mother was dead, and it sounded like she had been fending for herself for a while. "What about your dad?" he asked, hoping for a different answer this time. Nia shook her head, her voice barely a whisper. "I never knew him." Sheriff Daniels had dealt with his share of tough situations, but something about this young girl, so quiet yet so resilient, struck him harder than he could have imagined. He wanted to help, but the more he learned, the more helpless he felt. "Where do you sleep?" The question came out before he could stop himself, and he immediately regretted it. Nia's face tensed, her body recoiling slightly as if she had been struck. She didn't answer right away, but after a long pause, she finally murmured, "Here sometimes. Or at the park. It's safe at night if I stay hidden." The sheriff's chest tightened. He had always known his town had its share of struggles, but to realize that a child had been living on the streets unnoticed, right under his nose, it was unbearable. "Nia, you don't have to do this alone," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "We can figure this out together." But even as he said the words, he could see the doubt in her eyes. For a girl who had been through so much, trust didn't come easy. "I'm fine," she insisted, her tone defiant. "I don't need your help." Yet beneath the bravado, Daniels could see the truth. She was scared, tired, and desperate for someone to care. The next few nights weighed heavily on Sheriff Daniels' mind. Every time he passed the laundromat, the sight of Nia sitting alone stirred something deep inside him. A mixture of guilt, sorrow, and an overwhelming urge to protect her. He'd seen children in trouble before, but there was something about Nia's quiet resilience that made it impossible for him to walk away. He had tried to convince her to let him help, but each night, her answer was the same. "I'm fine," she'd say, her voice hardening as though to protect herself from the vulnerability that threatened to seep through her words. But Sheriff Daniels knew better. He had spent too many years on the force to be fooled by a child's facade of independence. Nia was a girl on the edge, and if he didn't intervene, the streets would eventually consume her. Still, he was torn. What could he do? He couldn't force her to accept help, and the system wasn't always kind to kids like Nia. Foster care, shelters. He'd seen too many children fall through the cracks, and the thought of putting Nia in that position filled him with dread. He had to find another way, but time was running out. One night, after another failed attempt to reach her, Sheriff Daniels sat in his patrol car, staring at the laundromat from across the street. He couldn't just keep watching from the sidelines. There had to be someone in town who knew more about her situation, someone who could provide answers. The laundromat owner, perhaps? Or maybe a neighbor from her old apartment. Determined to find a lead, Daniels spent the following day tracking down anyone who might have crossed paths with Nia and her mother. He started with the landlord of the rundown building where Nia said they used to live. The man, gruff and indifferent, confirmed that Nia's mother had lived there until she fell behind on rent. "She was a quiet one," the landlord said, scratching his head. "Didn't talk much, kept to herself. The girl, too. Sheriff Daniels pressed for more information, but the landlord shrugged, uninterested. They just disappeared one day. The rent was overdue for months. Figured they skipped town or something. The more Daniels dug, the more dead ends he encountered. Nia's mother seemed to have lived a life in the shadows, leaving behind little trace. That evening, as Daniels drove past the laundromat once again, he felt a deep sense of frustration. How had no one noticed this child's suffering? Why hadn't anyone stepped in to help? As he parked his car and approached the laundromat door, the weight of responsibility pressed down on him. He couldn't keep watching from a distance. Tonight, he would push harder, ask the difficult questions. But as the bell above the door jingled and he saw Nia sitting there, looking smaller and more fragile than ever, Sheriff Daniels realized something. Maybe he wasn't the one who could solve this. Maybe the only way to help Nia was to listen to what she truly needed. That night, something shifted. Sheriff Daniels approached Nia with a renewed determination. But this time, instead of questioning her, he simply sat beside her, silent. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The laundromat hummed quietly, the sound of machines filling the void between them. Nia glanced at him a few times, wary, but not fearful. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, her guard began to lower. She was used to people asking questions, demanding answers, but this was different. For the first time in a long time, someone was just there. No expectations, no pressure. After what felt like an eternity, Nia broke the silence. "You don't have to keep coming here," she said, her voice small but steady. Daniels didn't respond immediately. He had learned that silence, when used right, could be more powerful than words. Instead, he let her continue at her own pace. "I'm used to it. Being on my own, I mean. I've been doing it for a while now. My mom, she didn't have anyone either. It was always just the two of us." Nia's voice wavered as she spoke, the weight of her words heavy with unspoken grief. Sheriff Daniels listened, resisting the urge to fill the silence with reassurances. Nia exhaled shakily. She got sick really fast. One day she was fine, and the next, I don't know. It was like she was there, but not really. Her hands trembled as she spoke, her fingers twisting the fabric of her hoodie nervously. "I tried to take care of her. I really did. But I'm not. I wasn't enough." Daniel's chest tightened as the truth began to unravel. Nia wasn't just a girl left behind. She had been forced into the role of caretaker, far too young, and had watched her mother slip away while the world around them remained indifferent. "Your mother was lucky to have you," Daniels said softly. "What you did for her, it's more than most people could handle." Nia blinked rapidly, fighting back tears. "It wasn't enough," she repeated, her voice barely audible. "And now she's gone, and I don't know what to do. I don't know where to go." The vulnerability in her words broke something in Daniels. He had always prided himself on being strong, on keeping his emotions in check. But in that moment, sitting beside this girl who had been through more than any child should, the weight of it all was too much. Sheriff Daniels took a deep breath, choosing his words carefully. "You don't have to go through this alone, Nia. I know you don't trust me yet, but I'm here. And I'm not going anywhere." The silence that followed was thick with emotion. For the first time since he had met her, Nia didn't pull away. She didn't argue or tell him she was fine. Instead, she just nodded, a single tear escaping down her cheek. It was a small gesture, but in that moment, it was everything. Trust, fragile as it was, had begun to take root. The following day, Sheriff Daniels found himself sitting at his desk, the events of the previous night replaying in his mind. Nia's tearful admission, the fragile trust she had shown him, it all weighed heavily on his conscience. He knew he couldn't just leave her to fend for herself, but the question of how to help her without scaring her away plagued him. The foster system wasn't an option he was comfortable with, not after everything he had seen over the years. He needed a solution that would keep her safe, but still give her the independence she so fiercely clung to. After hours of contemplation, Daniels came up with a plan. He would start by finding a safe place for her, somewhere stable, but close enough to the laundromat that she wouldn't feel uprooted. Perhaps there was someone in town, a local family or a quiet, kind-hearted soul, who could offer her a room temporarily without the rigid formality of social services. But first, he needed to talk to Nia again, to let her know he wasn't giving up on her. That evening, Daniels parked his patrol car outside the laundromat earlier than usual. He waited, knowing Nia would show up soon, carrying her small basket of clothes like always. Sure enough, a little after 11 p.m. she appeared, slipping quietly into the laundromat. This time, Daniels didn't follow her inside immediately. Instead, he watched from the window as she went through her familiar routine, loading the machine, sitting down in her usual spot. The weary look in her eyes, the heavy weight she seemed to carry with her, only strengthened his resolve. When he finally walked in, Nia glanced up but didn't seem surprised. They had grown used to each other's presence, and though Nia still held back in many ways, Daniels could see the small signs that she was beginning to trust him. "I've been thinking," he said, sitting down beside her. Nia looked at him warily, waiting for him to continue. "You shouldn't have to sleep at the laundromat. You deserve better than that." He paused, gauging her reaction before proceeding. "I know you don't want to be sent away, and I won't push you to do anything you're not comfortable with. But I want to help you find somewhere safe, just for now, until we figure things out." Nia's expression was guarded, but Daniels could see the flicker of hope behind her eyes. "Where?" she asked, her voice uncertain. Daniels smiled softly. "I've been thinking about Mrs. Thompson. She lives near the edge of town, quiet place. She's kind, lost her own daughter a few years ago, and could use the company. It wouldn't be permanent, just until you feel ready to take the next step." He could see Nia considering it, her fingers nervously picking at the hem of her hoodie. After a long pause, Nia finally nodded. "Maybe," she whispered, her voice barely audible. It wasn't a full commitment, but it was more than Daniels had expected. He smiled gently. "That's all I ask. We'll take it one step at a time, Nia. You're not alone anymore." Nia looked at him then, her eyes full of uncertainty, but also something else, trust. Fragile and tentative, but growing. The next morning, Sheriff Daniels made the short drive out to the quiet house at the edge of town. Mrs. Thompson, a gentle woman in her 60s, had lived alone for years since her daughter passed. She was known for her kind heart and quiet strength, often volunteering at the local church and offering help to those in need. Daniels had known her for years and felt confident that if anyone could provide a safe space for Nia, it was her. As he knocked on the door, Daniels couldn't help but feel a bit nervous. He had no idea how Mrs. Thompson would react to his request, but when she answered the door, her soft eyes and warm smile instantly put him at ease. "Sheriff Daniels, what brings you here?" she asked, stepping aside to let him in. Daniels didn't waste time with pleasantries. He explained Nia's situation carefully, making sure not to reveal too much. After all, Nia's trust was still fragile, and Daniels knew he needed to protect her privacy. Mrs. Thompson listened quietly, her face growing more serious with every word. When Daniels finished, there was a long pause. Finally, she spoke, her voice soft but resolute. "Of course she can stay with me. No child should be out there alone like that." Daniels felt a wave of relief wash over him. Mrs. Thompson didn't ask for details, didn't question the situation. She just offered help, exactly as he had hoped. That evening, Daniels returned to the laundromat to find Nia already waiting, her laundry folded neatly beside her. As soon as he entered, she glanced up, her eyes searching his for answers. "I spoke to Mrs. Thompson," he said, taking a seat beside her. "She's ready for you, whenever you are." Nia's fingers tightened around the fabric of her hoodie, her eyes flickering with uncertainty. She had spent so long alone, surviving on her own, that the idea of accepting help, of relying on someone else, was terrifying. "What if she doesn't want me there?" Nia asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Daniels shook his head. "She does, Nia. She's a good woman, and she understands. This isn't about you being a burden. It's about you being safe." Nia was silent, her thoughts clearly racing. Finally, she nodded, though the fear was still evident in her eyes. "Okay," she whispered. "I'll go." The drive to Mrs. Thompson's house was quiet. Nia stared out the window, the weight of her decision heavy on her shoulders. When they arrived, Mrs. Thompson was waiting on the porch, a soft smile on her face. She greeted Nia warmly, offering her hand. Nia hesitated for a moment before taking it. For the first time in what felt like forever, she wasn't alone. As they entered the cozy house, Nia looked around, taking in the warm atmosphere. It was nothing like the cold, sterile feeling of the laundromat, where she had spent so many nights. Mrs. Thompson led her to a small, comfortable room at the back of the house. "This will be yours," she said gently. Nia stood in the doorway, her eyes wide. The room was simple, but to her, it felt like a sanctuary. For the first time in months, she felt a glimmer of hope. The first few days at Mrs. Thompson's house were a strange adjustment for Nia. After months of living in survival mode, sleeping in laundromats, parks, and any corner she could find, this quiet, warm home felt almost too safe. She was constantly on edge, half expecting the rug to be pulled out from under her. But as the days went by, the calmness of the house, the soft hum of Mrs. Thompson's daily routines, and the sheriff's reassuring presence when he checked in, started to chip away at the walls Nia had built around herself. Mrs. Thompson never pried. She would chat softly about her garden or the latest town gossip while making breakfast, but she never asked Nia about her past unless Nia volunteered information herself. The older woman seemed to understand that trust wasn't something you could demand. It had to be earned, slowly and carefully. Nia appreciated that. It allowed her to feel safe without the pressure of opening up before she was ready. One evening, a week after moving in, Nia found herself sitting in the living room, flipping through an old photo album Mrs. Thompson had left on the coffee table. The pictures were faded and worn, showing a much younger Mrs. Thompson with a girl who looked to be about Nia's age. As she flipped the pages, Nia began to piece together what she already suspected. This was Mrs. Thompson's daughter, the one who had passed away. The resemblance between them was striking, and Nia wondered how much of that loss Mrs. Thompson still carried with her every day. Her name was Lily. Mrs. Thompson's voice broke the quiet, and Nia quickly closed the album, startled. The older woman smiled gently. "It's okay, dear. You can look." She sat down beside Nia, her eyes soft but full of sadness. "Lily was about your age when I lost her. It was cancer. One minute, she was full of life, and the next, well, things changed so fast." Nia didn't know what to say, but Mrs. Thompson continued, her voice calm and reflective. "I know it's not the same. Your mother and Lily, they were different. But loss, it doesn't care who you are. It finds a way to leave a hole in your heart, no matter what." Nia looked down at her hands, her fingers nervously tracing the edges of the photo album. For the first time since arriving at Mrs. Thompson's house, she felt a connection, something that transcended words or explanations. They both understood loss, even if it was in different ways. "I miss her," Nia whispered, surprising herself with the confession. "My mom. She wasn't perfect, but she tried. She was all I had." Mrs. Thompson placed a gentle hand on Nia's shoulder. "I know, dear. I know." That night, as Nia lay in her new bed, the soft sheets a stark contrast to the cold surfaces she had slept on for so long, she felt something unfamiliar, peace. For the first time in what felt like forever, she allowed herself to relax, just a little. Mrs. Thompson's house, with its warmth and quiet kindness, was starting to feel like something Nia had forgotten existed. A home. Nia's life at Mrs. Thompson's house settled into a quiet rhythm. Each day brought a sense of normalcy that she hadn't felt in months. Small, simple routines that began to feel comforting rather than suffocating. But with that comfort came something else. The slow, creeping realization that she couldn't hide from her past forever. As much as she wanted to bury the memories of her mother's illness, of being alone, of nights spent in the laundromat, they surfaced more and more each day. Sheriff Daniels continued to visit regularly, checking in on her progress, always careful not to overstep. He'd often find her sitting on the porch, lost in thought, and though he never pushed, Nia could tell he was waiting for her to open up about what really happened. One evening, after dinner, as they sat outside watching the sunset, the sheriff finally asked the question that had been hanging in the air for weeks. "Nia, have you thought about what comes next? About where you want to go from here?" Nia tensed at the question. She had been avoiding it, hoping that if she didn't think about the future, she could stay in the safety of the present. "I don't know," she answered honestly, her voice barely audible. "I don't even know where to start." The sheriff nodded, understanding that Nia was still processing everything. You don't have to decide right away, but you should know you have options. I can help you look into schools, or find a more permanent place if you want to stay close by. Nia stared down at her hands, the weight of the decision pressing on her. It wasn't just about where she would live, or what she would do next. It was about facing the fact that her life had changed forever. She wasn't just a girl taking care of her sick mother anymore. She was alone in the world, and that truth terrified her. "What if I don't want to stay?" she blurted out, her voice shaking with emotion. "What if I just want to keep moving, like I did before?" The sheriff paused, surprised by her outburst. He could see the fear behind her words, the fear of settling down, of trusting people again. "Nia," he said gently, "you don't have to make that decision tonight, but running won't make the pain go away. Trust me, I've seen it before. What you're feeling, it won't disappear just because you move from place to place. You've been through a lot, more than any kid should, and it's okay to take your time to heal." Nia blinked back tears, frustrated with herself for feeling so vulnerable. "I don't know how to heal," she whispered. "I don't even know where to start." The sheriff leaned forward, his voice calm but firm. "You've already started, Nia. You took a step the moment you let us in. It doesn't happen overnight, but you're stronger than you think." Nia looked away, her heart heavy with the weight of his words. She wanted to believe him, but the road ahead felt so long, so uncertain. That night, as Nia lay in bed, her thoughts raced. The memories of her mother, the laundromat, the nights alone, they haunted her, refusing to fade. But for the first time, she allowed herself to cry. Not just the quiet, controlled tears she had shed before, but deep, gut-wrenching sobs that shook her entire body. It wasn't an instant fix, but it was a release. And as she cried, she realized that maybe, just maybe, Sheriff Daniels was right. Healing wasn't something that happened all at once. It was something that happened slowly, one step at a time. The next morning, Nia woke up with swollen eyes and a heavy heart. But for the first time in months, the weight felt slightly more bearable. There was still an ache deep inside her. But after the tears of the previous night, something had shifted. As she got dressed and stepped out into the kitchen, Mrs. Thompson was already preparing breakfast. The smell of fresh coffee and pancakes filled the room, and the sight of such a normal, everyday scene brought a small sense of comfort to Nia. Mrs. Thompson glanced at her with a soft smile. "Morning, dear. I made your favorite," she said, sliding a plate of pancakes across the table. Nia sat down, the warm food in front of her reminding her of quieter times when her mother would make breakfast for her. She picked up her fork, feeling a pang of sadness, but also gratitude for this new life that Mrs. Thompson had so generously given her. After breakfast, Sheriff Daniels stopped by for one of his routine visits. Nia could tell by the look in his eyes that he was still concerned about her. He never said it outright, but she could feel his silent encouragement, his unspoken reminder that healing wasn't something she had to do alone. "I've been thinking," he began, sitting down across from her at the kitchen table. "I know things have been hard, and I want you to know that whatever decision you make about your future, we'll support you. But I also think it might help to talk to someone who can help you process everything." Nia's instinct was to shut the idea down, to retreat into her shell again. Talking about her feelings still felt like opening a wound, one she wasn't ready to deal with. But as she looked into Sheriff Daniels' concerned eyes, she realized that maybe she didn't have to carry it all by herself anymore. "You mean like a therapist?" she asked hesitantly, her voice unsure. Daniels nodded, his expression kind but firm. "Yeah. Someone who's trained to help kids who've been through tough situations like yours. It's not about fixing you, Nia. It's about giving you the tools to start healing." Nia sat in silence for a moment, her mind racing. The idea of opening up to a stranger terrified her. But there was also a part of her that longed for relief, for someone to help her make sense of the overwhelming emotions she had been carrying. She glanced at Mrs. Thompson, who gave her a reassuring nod, and then back at Sheriff Daniels. "I'll think about it," she said quietly, and for now that was enough. As the days went by, Nia started to take small steps toward her healing. She still had nightmares, still struggled with the memories of her mother's illness and the nights spent alone in the laundromat. But slowly, she began to feel the cracks in her heart start to mend. Mrs. Thompson was patient, never pushing her to talk, but always there with a kind word or a gentle hug when Nia needed it. And Sheriff Daniels, true to his word, kept checking in, offering her a steady presence that made her feel less alone. One afternoon, as she and Mrs. Thompson were gardening in the backyard, Nia found herself opening up in ways she hadn't before. "I don't know if I'm ever going to feel normal again," she admitted, her voice low. Mrs. Thompson, kneeling beside her, paused and looked at her with understanding eyes. "There's no such thing as normal, dear. Everyone carries their own burdens, their own scars. But that doesn't mean you can't find peace, or even happiness again. It just takes time." Nia thought about those words long after they had been spoken. Maybe she wouldn't ever go back to being the carefree girl she had once been, but that didn't mean she couldn't move forward. She could still find moments of joy, still build a new life, even if it looked different from the one she had imagined. And as she stood in the garden, surrounded by the quiet beauty of the flowers blooming around her, Nia allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, healing was possible after all. Weeks passed, and with each day, Nia began to find more strength in her new life. The routines at Mrs. Thompson's house, though simple, offered her a stability she hadn't felt in so long. Each morning, she helped with chores, watering the garden, preparing meals, and tending to the small details of the house that made it feel like a home. Mrs. Thompson never asked for more than Nia was willing to give, but the quiet sense of purpose these tasks provided started to fill the empty spaces in her heart. Sheriff Daniels kept his promise, continuing to visit regularly. He wasn't just there as a sheriff anymore. He was a friend, a protector, someone Nia could rely on. His presence became a reminder that she wasn't alone, that people cared about her and were invested in her well-being. One afternoon, during one of his visits, he brought a stack of pamphlets and placed them on the kitchen table. "These are for some local schools," he explained. "I figured it might be time to start thinking about going back." The idea of school stirred something complicated in Nia. She hadn't thought about it in months, not since her mother had fallen ill and her world had collapsed. School had once been a normal part of her life, a place she could escape to. But now the thought of returning, of being surrounded by other kids and teachers, felt overwhelming. "I don't know," Nia said hesitantly, flipping through the pamphlets without really looking at them. "I haven't been in so long. What if I don't fit in?" Sheriff Daniels smiled kindly, sitting down beside her. "Nia, you're stronger than you realize. Fitting in doesn't matter as much as finding your own way. This could be a fresh start for you, a chance to rebuild, to create something new." He let his words sink in, giving Nia the space to process them. Mrs. Thompson, who had been listening quietly from the kitchen, chimed in softly. "You've been through more than most kids your age, Nia. But that doesn't mean you don't deserve the same opportunities. School isn't just about learning, it's about finding your place, and I think you might surprise yourself." The next few days, Nia found herself thinking more and more about what Mrs. Thompson and Sheriff Daniels had said. Part of her still felt hesitant, unsure if she was ready to step back into the world after everything that had happened. But another part of her, smaller but growing, felt curious. Could this really be a chance to start over? To rebuild her life, even if it meant doing things differently? One evening, while they sat together after dinner, Nia finally spoke up. "Maybe I could try school again," she said, her voice tentative but hopeful. Mrs. Thompson smiled warmly, reaching across the table to squeeze Nia's hand. "I think that's a wonderful idea," she said, "and we'll be here to support you every step of the way." Over the next week, they worked together to get everything ready. Mrs. Thompson helped Nia pick out new clothes, and Sheriff Daniels made sure all the paperwork was in order. On the morning of her first day back, Nia stood in front of the mirror, dressed in a new pair of jeans and a fresh shirt, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't know what to expect, but for the first time in a long time, she felt a glimmer of excitement mixed with the nerves. As she walked into the school that morning, the hallways buzzing with the sounds of students and teachers, Nia felt a knot of fear tighten in her stomach. But she also felt something else, the realization that this was her chance to heal, to grow, and to build the future she had never dared to imagine. And though the road ahead still felt uncertain, she knew she wasn't walking it alone anymore. The first few days of school were a whirlwind of new faces, lessons, and navigating the unfamiliar hallways. Nia felt out of place at first, awkward and unsure of herself. But Mrs. Thompson's gentle encouragement and Sheriff Daniel's quiet support gave her the strength to push forward. Slowly, she began to adjust, finding her way through the crowded halls and settling into her classes. She wasn't the same girl who had spent her nights in the laundromat, alone and afraid. She was starting to feel like she had a future, one she could shape for herself. One afternoon, after a particularly tough day of school, Nia sat on the porch with Mrs. Thompson, sipping lemonade in the fading light. The day had been overwhelming, but for the first time, Nia found herself talking about it openly. "I don't know if I'll ever really belong," she said quietly, her eyes focused on the sunset. "I feel different from everyone else. Like they all have these normal lives, and I don't even know where I fit in anymore." Mrs. Thompson smiled softly, her gaze fixed on Nia. "Belonging isn't about being the same as everyone else, Nia. It's about finding the people and places that accept you for who you are, no matter where you've been. You've been through a lot, and that's part of your story. But it's not all of it. You get to decide the rest." Nia looked down at her hands, thinking about those words. The idea that her story wasn't over, that she could write the next chapters, filled her with a cautious sense of hope. Later that evening, Sheriff Daniels stopped by. He had been following Nia's progress with quiet pride, watching as she began to carve out a new life. "You doing okay?" he asked, his familiar, reassuring presence grounding her. Nia nodded, though the doubts still lingered in her mind. "It's harder than I thought," she admitted. "But I'm trying." The sheriff smiled, his eyes full of warmth. "That's all anyone can ask for, Nia. You're stronger than most people I know. And no matter how hard it gets, remember that you don't have to do this alone." As the weeks passed, Nia started to find her footing. She made a few friends at school, began to participate more in class, and slowly, bit by bit, the weight of her past began to feel lighter. She wasn't forgetting her mother. She would never forget her. But she was starting to understand that carrying her memory didn't mean she had to carry the pain forever. It was okay to move forward, to let herself feel happiness again. One afternoon after school, Nia found herself back at the laundromat. The place that had once been a symbol of her isolation now felt different. Standing there, watching the machines spin, she realized how far she had come. The laundromat had been a place of survival, but now it was just a stop in her journey. A place she had passed through, but not one she was stuck in anymore. As she walked home, the sun setting behind her, Nia felt a sense of peace she hadn't felt in a long time. The road ahead was still uncertain, and there would be more challenges to face, but she knew she wasn't alone anymore. She had found people who cared about her, who had given her the chance to rebuild her life. And most importantly, she had found her own strength, something that no one could ever take away from her. Nia smiled to herself as she approached Mrs. Thompson's house, the lights glowing warmly in the windows. This wasn't the life she had imagined, but maybe it was better. She had a home, people who loved her, and the chance to create a future she could be proud of. As she stepped inside, greeted by Mrs. Thompson's welcoming smile, Nia realized that she had found something more important than survival. She had found hope. If you enjoyed this story and want to see more content like this, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. And now, you have a new video appearing on the screen, full of unexpected twists and heartwarming moments. Click and get ready for another inspiring story.